Hello and welcome to Careers Unlocked, a podcast brought to you by the EY Foundation. If you don't already know us, the EY Foundation supports young people on free school meals to access paid work experience, employability skills, and career guidance, and ultimately to further their opportunities in the world of work. We do this through a variety of programs and partnerships that meaningfully join up both sides of the labour market. I'm Kathryn Eastwood, Director of Income and Partnerships at the EY Foundation, and I'm delighted to be the host of the latest series of the podcast. I can't quite believe it, but we're on to the third and final episode of Careers Unlocked Season 2, but it's another one that is so relevant to all of us, regardless of where we are on our career journeys. The theme of today's episode is finding where you belong, and I can't wait to get started because we're going to be delving into topics such as the various pathways available after school, the feeling of belonging at work, and ultimately knowing which career pathway to pick. And as ever, we'll be bringing together a young person and an industry expert to talk about their experiences on this. We'll also be launching our next mini-sode in a couple of weeks. Regular listeners will know that mini-sodes are bite-sized segments that deliver practical tips on a whole range of topics to help prepare you for the workplace. If you've got an idea on what you'd like to get advice on, please get in touch at communications@eyfoundation.ey.com. Okay, let's get into today's episode. For today's episode, we are delighted to be joined by John Walker and Bob Athwal. First up, we have John, an EY Foundation ambassador who has supported us on several exciting projects, including featuring in a film to encourage young people to develop their employability skills. At the age of 12, John started his own business reselling shoes and clothes, which provided him with vital early experience of the skills needed to run a company. Through this, John developed a strong motivation to encourage others to develop essential business skills at an early age, and he is committed to helping young people have the best chance at success in their future. John is about to begin a new role in the investment banking team in the Bank of America this autumn. We're also lucky to be joined by Bob Athwal. Bob is the Culture and Belonging Director at Skyscanner, responsible for early careers, diversity, equity and inclusion, employer brand and employee engagement for Skyscanner globally. He is a regular speaker at international conferences, specialising in early careers, social mobility and racial equity, student experience and student outcomes. As well as being the co-founder of the Global Career Services Summit, Bob is also the co-founder of the 1 Hour Project, an initiative designed to level the playing field based upon his PhD to help advance social mobility amongst graduates. Well, you are both very welcome today, and having just read those bios, I'm actually incredibly surprised that you have time to be with us on the podcast. So we really appreciate it. Firstly, how are you both doing today? John, how are you?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here. It's my first podcast, so I'm looking forward to our conversation today, and I hope that it can provide some young people listening some useful knowledge.
Amazing. I've no doubts that it will. And Bob, what about you? How are you doing?
Really good, thanks, and thanks for having me. And really excited. I'm keen to listen to John. 12 years old, brilliant. That's impressive.
Thank you.
I was a late bloomer.
I think we all were compared to John.
Yeah,
Brilliant. Well, we really appreciate it. And I mean, like I said in the introduction, we've got so much to talk about today. So I just want to get straight into the conversation. And Bob, I'm going to turn to you first. And I'm going to ask that you bring us back to when you left school at the age of 16 or 18 or whenever that was. So I'm not going to speculate when school was, Bob, but can you talk us through the options that were available to you when you turned 16? And did you feel that these were well communicated to you at the time?
well, that was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I
Okay.
can tell you. Um, the answer's no. I went to a boys' school. It was by default because that's kind of where I lived. It was either boys' schools or girls' schools, and that was it. And I couldn't really find my place. I just felt like I didn't fit in. I didn't think I had a lot of intellect, to be honest. And so, at the end of school, you can do an apprenticeship as they were then, become an electrician, plumber, etc., or go to college and do A levels or GMVQ, I think it
Mm.
was. But there was no real careers guidance. Couldn't really speak to my parents about what kind of pathway I would take because I think, Kathryn, you know this, but my mum's illiterate. Both my parents were working class, so no idea of how the professional environment works. So it was very poor.
So, I mean, having said all that, Bob, how did you then decide on your career path, and what were the main factors that affected that decision?
I think I was really lucky, and when I say really lucky, I had some really good mates whose
Mm.
parents have got professional occupations or, had been to university or had done other things. And so there's a couple of friends of mine, Catherine and Jane, who are probably my two best mates, and kind of took me under their wing, really. And by sheer hanging around with them, you kind of get open to other experiences and opportunities that you don't understand, but you kind of think they sound interesting. And actually, I never really knew what I wanted to do, but it was one of those that I was always comfortable around people,
Mm.
and I think when people say, "Oh, I'm a people person," you have to actually understand what that actually means. And being comfortable around people, I could probably persuade most people to do what I wanted them to do. And so I had this
Mhm.
ability to influence people in a way that they didn't realize, or I didn't realize that it was such a skill that I had no idea that it was a skill. It was just the fact that it came natural. And so you start to pick up things that you're good at. And then it's really about understanding how do these translate into an environment. And so that came much later. I just had a skill, and some of these skills were real strengths of mine,
Mm.
that I now look back and realize what was happening and what was going on, and the people around me to help me hone those skills.
It's really interesting that you were talking about your network and those couple of friends who obviously were so integral to those formative years. And actually, it almost sounds like by chance you fell into certain routes and pathways and were able to identify those skills in yourself that were really going to be important for the rest of your career.
They're called turning points. If you look at it from an academic
Mm.
perspective, they're sort of turning points is the theory that sits behind them. So, I grew up in Birmingham. I know I don't sound like it, but as a Brummie, I was in an area that was full of the sort of wave of immigrants, the Windrush
Mm.
generation, to kind of help rebuild the country after the war. And then my dad got made redundant in the 80s. And then we ended up on the south coast. I ended up in a leafy part of Southampton
Mm.
where suddenly I was one of three kids that weren't white. And,
Mm.
that was quite a shock because I had a funny accent and I had no clue about some of the things that they were talking about. I just hadn't been exposed to those things. And I think that kind of turning point of my parents' move into the South Coast was a game changer, really. And then that's where you don't belong because then all of a sudden you don't quite fit in and you don't understand what's going on. And so it could have gone easily another way, if I'm honest, Catherine. There are some friends of mine that perhaps didn't do as well as they should have. And I'm just lucky that I always had this compass within me from my parents about self improving,
Mm.
trying to be better. I just wanted things. I mean, I admired John, in his intro. It just, you had to be quite entrepreneurial. I used to sell cassettes and videos of the latest things that I won't admit to on the podcast. But, if I wanted a pair of Jordans, which was way beyond my kind of budget, you'd have to kind of do things
Mm.
because my parents couldn't afford it.
Mhm. No, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing all that. And I think that concept of turning points is one that I think we'll probably get into in a bit more detail today about those different factors, both in terms of the environment around you and maybe those intrinsic motivations that you talked about, Bob, in terms of the entrepreneurial spirit that can really take that turning point and impact whether it goes one direction or completely the other way. So I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about the various factors in both of your lives that have influenced that to date, and definitely getting a bit further into the sense of belonging too. But John, I mean, turning to you for now, you've got such an incredible story and you're clearly so driven. In terms of after school, and of course, take us back to when you were 12 as well. I want to hear more about that. But what options did you consider for your post 16 pathway, and how did you then make those decisions?
Well, I think I always knew that I wanted to pursue a career in investment banking. That realization sort of came shortly after selling shoes. Ever since I was a kid, I've always wanted to be in the world of business. Not necessarily sure in what capacity, but I knew that was always something that I wanted. Growing up with a single mum, I always wanted to be able to have something of my own to support my family, some kind of business. But of course, you need to gain knowledge, skills to be able to do that. So I've always wanted to start my own business. And ultimately, when I was 12, my sister, she got a pair of the Kanye West shoes, the Yeezys. And I'd seen these all online and I was like, oh, I've seen those before. And then I looked up how much they were. I was like, wow, that's worth a lot of money. So a couple of days rolled around, got the laptop, got the iPad, got the phone, got everyone's devices, even the TV. So I got some of these shoes. I think I got like 2 or 3 pairs. And of course, I just started building up from there and started the business. It wasn't until I'd like to say 14 or 15, I was aware that investment banking is sort of where I want to specialize. And obviously, I spoke to my teachers about it. And I wasn't aware that you could even do a degree apprenticeship or any kind of work experience. So the path that was laid out to me in secondary school was basically top 5 uni, and then you can become an investment banker. Which, of course, as a 15, 16-year-old, that's quite daunting, being told that you can only do investment banking if you go to one of these top 5 universities that only a couple people in your college go to a year. So, of course, when that's your dream, that is quite frightening. So when I started sixth form college, I found the EY Smart Futures program through like the college careers board, which was great. I applied, and since then, I've learned so much about all the other work experience programs you can do. So I finished Smart Futures. I was thinking, I want to do more work experience. I'm not done. So I looked into PwC, JP Morgan, and then that's when I came across all the obviously degree apprenticeships that they do. So I was like, oh, well, this seems perfect. Because of course, Bob, I don't think you mentioned degree apprenticeships. Is that a fairly new thing, Bob?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So I think degree apprenticeships are just amazing. Being able to work with trained professionals, getting experience while also obviously learning the qualifications necessary to do the job. You just come out at the end of it with an incredible wealth of knowledge. So yeah, that was when the realization hit that I wanted to go degree apprenticeship, not university, just after doing sort of Smart Futures and all that. Which sort of led me to look into other programs. I was kind of strategic about it. I was like, which programs are most likely to sort of, perk up the recruiters' ears. So that's when I looked into the Exeter Scholars Programme, because most of the degree apprenticeship are done by University of Exeter. So I did a Scholars Programme with Exeter, stayed there for a week. Again, that worked well.
If I can just jump in there, that's been so
Of
useful
course,
so
yeah.
far. And I'm just thinking, some of the people who'll be listening to the podcast will probably be considering the same thing. Should I
Yeah.
go to university? Should I think about a degree apprenticeship?
Yeah.
What was the real pull for you to the degree apprenticeship?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's being able to work alongside people that are already professionals. They've got the qualifications, because then you can actively ask them questions. What can you do to improve? What do you wish you had done? That was a huge factor. Obviously, the salary. I think a lot of young people nowadays, they just want to earn money.
Yeah.
So again, that is a huge motivating factor, the salary. I think independence as well, just sort of feeling less like a student and more like a working adult. Since I was young, I've always been quite independent. Like my mum's always been in that hospital, since a very young age. So I was sort of forced to mature quite early. So I think as it came to sort of the time to choose uni or an apprenticeship, in my mind, I'm ready for the world of work. I think that's the best route for me. And of course, you have no debt. That's a huge thing. You have no student debt. And I just couldn't recommend it anymore.
Yeah.
The culmination of all those things just makes it the top tier choice, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, of course. And I guess looking back to where you started in business at the age of 12, if you were ready for it then, I've no doubt that leaving school, you knew in yourself what your skills were and what you'd learned already, and you were probably just excited to apply that
Yeah.
in a way that you could start feeling as if you're part of the workforce and making money and continuing to develop. So, no, it's a really inspiring story. But in terms of the process itself and making those decisions and applying and getting on the scholars course and then into the apprenticeship, what have you found most difficult, and have you encountered any barriers along the way?
I think the most difficult part was probably like the assessment centres. Again, you don't get that for a lot of work experience programs, I think. I'm pretty sure it's just phone interview and that resume. But when it came to the apprenticeships, assessment centres was definitely the biggest hurdle. In terms of barriers, I feel like the barriers are actually, in some places anyways, I feel like they're quite accommodating. I mean, the main barriers I could see is obviously grades. I think maybe they could be a bit more accepting of GCSE grades, as long as English and maths is fine, of course. But it didn't really affect me. But I can imagine that there's people out there that'll hold back,
Yeah.
because they simply won't be able to get the foot in the door because they didn't try hard enough at secondary school when they were younger. But yeah, I think that's the main barriers, in my opinion.
Bob, listen to John talk about his story and his choices post school and everything. If you had the choice to go back and explore a different avenue, would you? And if so, which one would you choose?
It's a question that I've been asked a few times, and I know what I'm about to say sounds not true, but I wouldn't actually change it. And I wouldn't change it for a couple of reasons. Look, I've no doubt, just John, listening to you, I can see why you've been hired. People like me who've been trained to hire people like you know within a nanosecond. And then what happens is you verify it based on evidence, your gut feel, and then your evidence is what kind of supports it. And I can just hear the kind of ingredients that have happened along the way, that osmosis of natural forces that has then made you who you are. The only thing I'd say to you is that, trust me, it goes really quickly. Take time to enjoy it as well, because otherwise work can become this thing that all consuming. So make sure you take time to be looking after your well-being as much as getting to the place that you've wanted to get to. Why I wouldn't change it is the learning and the failure. John just mentioned that he had to mature quickly. I was in a similar situation. I've got older siblings. I'm the youngest at 50, and so I've got older siblings that had a sort of generational foot in a different generation to myself. And I guess the point being is when you have to mature a little bit early, you kind of probably rejection or sort of failure are kind of quite commonplace. And so you kind of develop this resilience in a way that you don't realize. Doesn't mean that you're not sad. There are moments in my life when it was painful and I wouldn't want to repeat
Mm,
those. But if I didn't want to change it, unfortunately, I have to repeat those because even those were learning points for me. And what I'm able to do now at this stage in my career is recognize actually all of those things, those collection of experiences that have actually shaped me and where I've managed to be successful in my roles,
mm,
not just this one, is because I have this breadth of experience that many of my peers don't. And they might have other experiences that I don't, but that's what makes us diverse is when you come together with those collection of experiences, actually you're quite a really powerful, interesting team. And so I think my experience is what I now kind of describe, and I know you'll get into the belonging piece afterwards, but I've been saying for a long time, anyone who talks about culture fit, it's never going to be
mm.
truly diverse because they only want people that look like them, sound like them, have had the same opportunities as them. The culture adding is when you bring different people in that have had different experiences that can look at problems differently and solve them in a different way. And that, for me, is why I wouldn't change those because those experiences is what's made me stand out. There are times I've been rejected by no names mentioned of organisations you will both know because I didn't fit in, but that's okay because they weren't looking for me to add to them. And that's something that I would strongly recommend that those that are early in their careers looking for work, thinking about opportunities, don't compromise who you are is the takeaway, and be happy to be your authentic self in the sense that, look, make no mistake, you go into a professional environment, but that doesn't mean you have to compromise yourself. And so there is some rules of a professional environment, and so those are important to learn and understand, but actually your authentic self in a professional environment is what you've got to go for. And sometimes you're going to hit some invisible barriers that you don't even know exist, but they will be there. But if you stay true to your values and what you bring to it, then you'll kind of outshine eventually those barriers, which is why those experiences that I've had, I wouldn't change, even the worst ones.
Incredible. I loved hearing that, particularly the idea of all the times that you failed that you wouldn't change. It's actually something we spoke about a couple of episodes on this podcast. So if you're listening to this one and you didn't listen to the failure one, please go back a couple of episodes and listen to that. But exactly that, we talked about the power of failure and turning it into a learning and building it into the next step. So it's so great to hear you talk about that. And similarly, something we spoke about in the last episode, you'd think I'm just here to plug this entire podcast, but we talked about the term cultural fit just being another way to describe bias, and actually, it's not an inclusive term about diversity at all, and it's something we need to be extremely careful when we're thinking about and talking about. And then I loved that you actually anticipated my next question because I was going to ask about the best piece of advice that you could have heard at that age. So you gave it a really good piece of advice to our listeners about staying true to yourself and being authentic. But I'm going to stick with that question that I was going to ask because I don't know if it's going to be the same answer. So, what do you think is the best piece of advice that you could have heard when you were leaving school?
I think. that you've got something to bring to the
Hmm.
party. So it's a two-way process. And even more so now that, like I said, I'm at a different stage in my career, but that doesn't mean I know it all. As a 50-year-old bloke, I don't know it. And actually, what I do need is people like John and others to help me, check my own biases, because I've even got
Hmm.
biases, right? Whether I realize or not. But also, how I might approach a problem now might be better suited in addressing in a different way. And so don't be afraid to come to someone like me who's been working for a while to kind of say, actually,
Hmm.
how about if we were to do it this way? So the point being that solution, there are lots of problems that we're all trying to solve. The sort of challenge is people don't know how to put a solution in place. So we'll tell you that there's a problem and it's
Yeah.
your problem to deal with. What I need is people to help me kind of come to the solution and that co-creation, but have the confidence to know that you have probably got skills and experiences in
Hmm.
an area which I don't. And with your experience and my experience collectively, we've got
Hmm.
more chance of solving this stuff. So don't be afraid to kind of put your own experience at the front of something.
Hmm.
And if it's wrong and you fail, then that's fine. It's a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid to kind of, if you see something you think, that doesn't feel right, actually, maybe we should do it this way, have the confidence to believe that you might actually be in the right track.
Yeah. I love that as a piece of advice in terms of just having complete conviction in your own skills. And I think for a lot of the maybe younger people listening to the podcast, what they will be able to bring to an apprenticeship or an organization or a university degree or any of those things may be skills that the recruitment people don't necessarily have in that generation. So to know that because they're a little bit different, that they're equally worthwhile and like you said, Bob, it's important to bring those with full confidence.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I get Be Real, I get Snapchat, I get all of that stuff. I get Discord. I understand it, right?
Hmm.
I get it. Do I use it? No. Do I fully utilize it? No. Can I sit there and watch YouTube all day and night? No. But actually, that doesn't matter, does it? It's like, help me understand actually how that could be part of
Yeah.
the solution. And I think that's the point I'm making, is that it's not that I don't understand it. It may not be the thing that floats me,
Hmm.
and so that is a real life example when people say, "What do you mean by that?" And technology is all around us in part of the solution, and various channels, podcasts
Mm.
included. So a group of us that have been in the workplace for a while actually are not dismissive. It's just not how we've
Hmm.
grown up.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are going to get into belonging soon 'cause we keep scratching the surface off it. But before we do, just thinking finally again about the post 16 options and leaving school. John, if you were to give a piece of advice to people who were in your shoes or are currently at that stage of their lives, what's the key piece of advice you'd give to them in terms of making those decisions for their future pathway post 16?
Again, Bob, I mean, you absolutely nailed it there. I think imposter syndrome is something that affects a lot of people, not just young people. So I think to have conviction in you really is something important, especially when you're applying to jobs that you may feel like, oh, will I do well? Will I fit in? Will I belong? So when all those things come into question, it's natural to sort of question it. So I think to have the confidence in your ability is a key thing. But also, like, I think don't be sort of scared to reach for your goals, to have ambition. Don't be ashamed. Obviously, ever since I was young at 12, I've always had this entrepreneurial spirit. I've always wanted to do these things. But being young and having an entrepreneurial spirit is often met with criticism. People are like, well, that's unrealistic, etc. So you can sort of see how a lot of people maybe have that entrepreneurial spirit and that ambition and lose it. And that's something I've always had and not let anyone take away from me. So I think never lose sight of what your goals are and, put in the work to figure out how you can get there and make it easy for yourself. If you can do work experience, which will give you more skills and make recruiters like you more, do it. So that's ultimately my advice to young people. Don't let other people's judgment cloud your dreams and then the path that you're on and that you want to do. And give some thought to each sort of step you take along the way and have conviction in your actions.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. And it might be that at the time you don't necessarily know where every single step is going to go, but looking back, all of a sudden it all just makes sense, doesn't it? And
Yeah,
we went through all of those different challenges and the different stages of the journey to get to hopefully exactly where we're all supposed to be.
exactly. It's about the journey, not the destination.
Exactly, exactly.
Catherine, I was going to say the only
Yeah.
other thing that I would just add to what John was saying, have conviction and everything else that you've said, is how you benchmark. So knowing your own pathway and not worrying about what others have got. And in all my work experiences, and I've had some interesting ones, the people that suffer the most are the ones that are looking at the others and thinking, why haven't I got what they've got?
Hmm.
And then that clouds your conviction and clouds your own pathway because you're not comparing apples with apples.
Mm,
And so, staying true and knowing what is important to you as opposed to what someone else has got is really, really important. It's a slippery slope otherwise because you're
mm,
constantly wrestling with something. And in my view, there are people that have more than me, there are people that have less than me. I'm lucky in what I've got and I'm really proud of what I've got. I could have more, I could have less.
mm.
So the minute you start looking at thinking I need more and more and more, it really does eat away. And I've seen so many colleagues just get torn up on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I just personally think that today it's even more of an issue because you go on social media everywhere you look, you see everyone's success. But of course, on social media, things aren't as they seem. Young people, they'll see all social media, what people are doing their age, and I think they just get demotivated because they think, well, they've got this at an earlier age. Whatever it be, it can be a huge demotivating factor for a lot of young people. And as Bob said, it's a slippery slope. So I think that's why it affects young people primarily. I don't even use social media much personally for that one reason.
Yeah, I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth, John. That's exactly what I was going to say, that in this day and age, it's so tempting because we have so much access to other people's lives, or at least the aspects of their lives that they allow us to see and that they put on Instagram or LinkedIn or any of those other platforms. And therefore, it's so tempting to compare yourself to other people. But I think actually it's probably a mindset thing where why don't we just turn it around and try and be inspired by other people's success to be happy for them and think actually, where am I today compared to where I was yesterday, and where do I want to be in a few weeks, few months, few years' time, and take that inspiration from those different places around us. Because I think we can talk about social media and we can talk about the risks of comparison and all of these things, but I think ultimately there comes a time where we have to take responsibility for ourselves and what it is that we're letting in and how we're thinking about that, and letting it shape our actions and our thoughts as well. Right. Thinking about belonging, and I really want to get into imposter syndrome, and you've mentioned that already, John, so I'll get into that in a second. But firstly, Bob, so you are the Culture and Belonging Director at Skyscanner. Can you tell us what it means to feel a sense of belonging at work?
I think it's really important that if we truly want to represent the societies that we operate in, then you've got to kind of start thinking about inclusion in a different way. So bring in diverse talent in through whether it's apprenticeships, whether it's grad programs, whether it's experienced hires, etc. Universities shouldn't matter, schools shouldn't matter, part of the country shouldn't matter, accents shouldn't matter,
Mm,
your heritage shouldn't matter, etc., etc. So the point we're making around belonging is, look, no matter what your identity is, nothing should stop you from progressing, being successful, however high or horizontal your ladder is. It should not be a barrier. So belonging really is about making sure that these biases are removed and that you can thrive and do your best work and achieve what you've set out to achieve. And so what we're working on really hard constantly is to how do we do that? And that's not always easy because there are some trade-offs, and the trade-offs are that we want to include everybody but we can't exclude others. So sometimes there's some compromise and conversation that's required, and those sometimes could spill out into political views, it could spill out into geopolitics, it could be other things, right? But the point is, I've still got to work with people that are different to me. That's what makes us successful. And sometimes we may not agree, but how do we behave in a way that is respectful? How do we behave in a way that encouraging and supporting and doesn't start then to bring in these biases? Well, you're only saying that because of X.
mm,
And so belonging is really kind of that values and behaviors and that purpose of doing your best work but representing society as you can. within context of what you're able to do. I mean, we're a tech business in travel, so we can only solve with our experiences of all of those diverse experiences, we can only solve certain parts of the problem. We'll need other people and other sectors to help us solve the other parts of the problem. And collectively, that's how you do it. And I guess that's the difficult part of belonging sometimes, is because the expectation is you've got to solve everything and everything. And that is not always possible. But organisationally, we know the role that we play in people's lives now. And I think people trust their employers more than they trust other societal structures. And so we've got a bigger role to play. And I guess that's why the types of opportunities such as my role exist, really, is about
Mm.
how do you add to the culture. And then once you add to the culture, you've got to keep people here. So you've got to make them feel like they're a part of it and they belong. And it's not that they're just a tick box exercise. And that's the belonging piece, is the authentic, making sure that people genuinely feel like, okay, these are my people. It doesn't matter what my background is, and we're all different and complicated, but these are my people and we're going to do good work together.
That's so interesting to hear about the level of trust people have in their employers compared to other structures and other organizations. And I think it comes back to that. I mean, we all have a fundamental, very basic human need to feel like we belong to something greater than ourselves. So it sounds like employers actually have a huge responsibility in that case to make people and to help people feel like they belong. In terms of imposter syndrome, we speak about it quite a lot, we hear about it quite a lot. We all probably say that we suffer from it. And obviously, it's the idea that you can feel like a fraud and that your abilities aren't good enough for the job that you're in, and the sort of fake it till you make it culture. But it feels to me that we put a lot of pressure on the individual as if it's something that the individual has to fix. How can they feel as if they're less of an imposter and what can they do? But I really feel like it actually should be something that we're looking at with regards to the environment that individual is in, and that actually it's the environment that helps ensure that that person doesn't have those feelings as an imposter. So, Bob, just back to you again. Is this something that we as individuals can avoid feeling, or is it something that actually the organization should be forthcoming in ensuring that we don't feel like that?
I think it's a bit of both. I honestly do. I think each and every one of us will doubt ourselves sometimes when we're stretched, right? So you're
Mm,
learning when you're stretched is really, really important. But I've taken a new piece of responsibility, and it's the first time I've done this in my career, and even I felt like, well, okay, I don't know what's going on here.
mhm,
But the learning from it is huge. And I just have to remind myself that just because it may not have been perfect in the way I want it delivered, actually it's an opportunity for me to learn. And I'm really fortunate. I've got a good boss, right?
mhm,
And he says to me that, hey, you're going to get better at this. And that encouragement from colleagues and your kind of managers is so, so important. So, even though I'm not one that normally needs a pat on the back because I'll just get on and do things, it's important for confirmation that, look, you've tried to do it in the best way that you can, and actually
mhm,
you're just going to get better with more experience. And that's what you have to remember.
mhm,
The imposter syndrome is almost a bit like the social media piece. On the surface, it appears everyone's like better than you, or look, you're going to come across people that are smarter than you, no doubt. But actually, for the most part, in my experience, most people I've met with, and they're in senior positions or they're at various positions, you're like, how on earth have they got there? When you start working with them, you start realizing that actually all is not what it seems. And so that fake it to make it thing is so prevalent that you
mhm,
think, okay. So I don't think you can get away from it, because the construct of it is shaped in us from an early age,
mhm,
really, and the environment that we have been surrounded with. It's not to say you can't break out of it, but there's this kind of vulnerability.
mhm.
And I think there's something that kind of keeps your feet on the ground and has a bit of humility.
Yeah.
If you've got this vulnerability in you that kind of recognizes that, look, I can't wing this. You're going to have to work really hard and figure this out. And again, for me, it's the learning bit. And trust me, I don't like being vulnerable,
Mhm.
but I recognize that it's important in order to continually grow.
Yeah.
And I've worked in 4 or 5 different sectors, from energy to higher education to tech, and each time I've had to reinvent myself. So there's an element of vulnerability. That imposter piece can come in, but I don't really say it that way. It's a confidence piece. It's about, I ain't confident that I'm good at it yet, but I will get good at it. And that mindset is what helps me through it. And I think companies that have managers that recognize that, or colleagues that will help and support you, is what helps you get through it. We've got amazing colleagues not just managers that kind of will support you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say exactly the same thing about the humility aspect of it. And I think there's something around, I don't know if it's ego or if it's pride or if it's back to the comparison that we all think we have to look as if we're really fully in control and we know exactly what we're doing. But ultimately, we don't because, well, what's the fun in that? If that's true for a start, then we're not growing and we're not learning and we're not trying new things. So I think it's the sooner you can accept and even set the tone amongst colleagues and amongst friends of being openly vulnerable, but having the mindset that you're excited and willing to learn, then surely that can only be better for your own career and for others too.
And I think if you want a takeaway for that, the takeaway is look, vulnerability, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. The bit that you'll fall down on continually is not working on a solution to try and fix that vulnerability to the point of what's causing the vulnerability, not the vulnerability itself.
Hmm.
But everyone's allowed to have a moment, and a moment might take a week, it might take some of us a day, it might take some of us 3 or 4 months, right? But the point is, when you don't have a solution or you don't have colleagues to have a co creation solution, that's where you're going to come unstuck a little bit in the workplace. And so that reflection of learning from it and having that moment, it's fine. However long that moment takes, and we're all different. But it's really then thinking about, okay, what am I going to do differently?
Yeah.
Next time I'm in this situation, what am I going to do differently? And that's the bit that people then say, look, you're not respecting my well-being, or you're not appreciating that actually I was quite vulnerable there. It's no, I am. But what you're going to do differently next time you're in that situation? What's the learning you're taking out
Hmm.
of it? And that doesn't mean I don't care about you and your well-being. It means about, look, next time we're in that situation, what can we do differently and how can we avoid something? And that stretch piece is so important. And I think sometimes people feel like they can't be honest, and there's no time limit. I mean, you're going to have to work this out. Some of us it takes a day, some of us it takes 2 3, sometimes it takes a week or however long.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know when I've done something it takes me 2 days and then I kind of get bored of it with myself,
Hmm.
and that's me. But I'm different to people, and some people will operate that way, some people won't, and that's okay.
Yeah. And then I guess bringing it back to the belonging piece, it's being in an environment where you feel like you can be completely vulnerable and have those open conversations. John, what about you? Did you ever feel this sense of imposter syndrome at any point to date in your career? So, from when you were starting your own business at 12 to when you were applying for apprenticeships, did you ever have any of those feelings? And how do they manifest themselves?
I mean, I think for me, it's just usually when I've done something new or something that I feel like is just me out of my depth. So when I went for my first JP Morgan interview, the imposter syndrome really struck then, and I think it was the fear of failure. So I got there, I had everything I wanted to say in my head, but the words just wouldn't come out. But again, it's a learning experience. Because of that, I had some self reflection. I was like, well, what really went wrong there? With JP Morgan, it was just entirely new. And of course, it's been my dream to go to an investment bank. As a college student, you're like, I'm around all these professional investors. So again, it was just a really daunting experience. But I mean, it sort of prepared me for my Bank of America interview and all the interviews I did after that. So I'm grateful for that experience. But I think it's just when something is new, that's what it's been to me. So, like, again, when I had the CEO forum, first few calls we had for that, I was a bit quiet. I sort of didn't really know what to say because that imposter syndrome really struck. I was like, whoa, I'm in a call discussing meeting some CEOs. I'd, of course, never done anything like that in my life. And I think some people, they might be all right with it. They might not give much thought to it because they've had similar experiences in corporate settings or their families are professionals. I just never even met a CEO or any kind of professional prior to that. So I think that's why it was a bit scary. But once I did it, ripped the bandage off, it was smooth sailing and I was able to sort of develop a lot because of it.
Hmm.
It still hits every now and then, but then I just sort of remind myself of all the things I have done, all the time that I think I've done well in something.
It's almost like bringing yourself back to the evidence. It's like, well, look at everything that you have done to get to this place
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now. And it's, I think often a lot of our thoughts are lies for a start.
yeah.
We tell ourselves ridiculous things. So sometimes you just have to bring it back to the fact that you've got the apprenticeship, you've succeeded thus far, and why should your next steps be any different?
Mm.
So you've obviously made a big decision and you're starting this apprenticeship in the autumn time. Where do you hope that your career will take you?
The reason I signed on investment banking was because you get not only do you learn so much about investing or the fundamentals of business, but you also get to meet so many companies at the biggest times in the company's career. So I think that was a huge factor because I was like, well, even if investment banking's not for me, which I think it is, I'll meet so many people, I'll learn so much, and I'll work with so many other businesses. It's common knowledge that there's a lot of exit opportunities in investment banking. I mean, whether I go to private equity or work in a hedge fund or something, that is a potential. I mean, part of me has always wanted to work for BlackRock or Rothschild. That'd be nice. Either a really large or a really old institution. I think, I take pride in working for that. That's why I take pride in working for Bank of America, because of course they're a large business and I feel like I'm making a difference by working there. I'm working with large sums of money, helping businesses make money. So again, making a difference is a huge sort of fundamental part of any job that I do or
Yeah.
any thing that I do like this, for example. I hope it makes a difference.
I've no doubts that it absolutely will. And in terms of the making a difference piece, is that something that you think feeds into your sense of belonging at an organization?
Definitely. I mean, if there's something wrong in an organization, I think that sort of gives me more motivation to make it better. In terms of belonging, I think that perhaps is maybe what I bring to the table, bring the team together. Maybe that's one of my unrealized skills that I hadn't really picked up on before, but it is definitely something that motivates me. I always want to make a difference, however small or however big.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you. And then, Bob, just finally back to you. So, obviously, it is your job to oversee so many people across the organization and ensure that they feel a sense of belonging. But on a very personal basis for you, what is it that you feel creates a sense of belonging for you in a workplace?
I think it's probably twofold. It's my colleagues genuinely knowing that when I talk to colleagues, they're talking to me and me alone, and then they're not trying to look at me and think, okay, where's this guy from? That type of stuff. So genuinely interested in me having a conversation and avoiding classic kind of microaggressions and various other things. But I think it's the commonality as well, so that there's some colleagues that I can talk to about a hobby, or some I can talk to about films, or someone I can talk about music. And so having lots of different colleagues that have got lots of different interests as well, and that helps with the belonging. And we're not a remote first company, we're 2 days a week, 3 days a week tops in the office. So that social connection piece only then helps with that belonging. And so for me, our office was designed for collaboration, really. So if you come in, we're kind of hoping you're going to chat, not sit on Zoom sort of thing. But I think that authenticity of that I can talk to different people with different hobbies or interests is really, really important.
Brilliant. Well, as I said earlier, I feel like the three of us could talk for a much longer time, but I think that brings us to a natural close. So, a huge thank you to you both for joining us today. We've covered so many topics, and you've both given us so much to think about, right from having absolute conviction and confidence in your own unique skill set when you leave school, to avoiding comparison with other people's career journeys once you enter into the world of work, being open to being vulnerable and learning and having an open mindset, and ultimately finding different points of connection with other people in the workplace to really feel that sense of belonging. It's been a really interesting episode, and I'm sure our listeners thought the same. Thank you all for listening. And if you liked today's episode, please click to follow us and leave a review as it will help more people find us. That's all for today. We'll be back soon with more fantastic guests on the next series of the podcast. But in the meantime, keep an eye out for our mini-sode. Thank you for listening and see you again soon.